Mississippi, 1944. The delta stretched flat and green under a sky thick with August heat, cotton fields rolling toward horizons that shimmered like water. In a farmhouse kitchen outside Clarksdale, James Whittaker poured sugar into a pitcher of tea, the crystals dissolving into amber liquid while cicadas screamed outside his window. 2 miles down the dirt road, behind wire fencing and wooden watchtowers, 30 German women stood in formation at Camp Clinton, their gray prison uniforms dark with sweat. They had been told Americans were barbarians. They would soon be offered sweet tea. The war had brought strange cargo to the Deep South, prisoners by the thousands, shipped across an ocean to work fields their captors could no longer tend. But these were not the expected prisoners. Not the Africa Corps veterans filling camps in Texas. Not the U-boat crews in Louisiana. These were women. Nurses mostly. Some telegraphists. A few clerical workers from Wehrmacht offices in North Africa. Captured when Rommel's lines collapsed, when the desert campaigns ended in dust and surrender. None of them had imagined Mississippi. Camp Clinton sat on land that had once been a cotton plantation, its boundaries marked by the same wire that penned livestock, its guard towers built from Delta pine. The women arrived on a Tuesday morning in July, stepping from military trucks into humidity so thick it felt like drowning. Corporal Sarah Mitchell, Women's Army Corps, watched them file past, noting their pallor, their rigid backs, the way they kept their eyes forward even as they scanned everything. The prisoners ranged in age from 19 to 47. Most had been nurses at field hospitals in Tunisia. A few had served with Signal Corps units. All had been processed through North African transit camps before the long Atlantic crossing, then trains through the American South to this place where the land lay flat as a mirror, and the air hung heavy with river water. They had expected cruelty. Instead, they found efficiency. The camp commandant, Major Robert Hayes, had fought in the Great War. He remembered Belleau Wood, remembered German prisoners he had guarded in France who had been teenagers conscripted into something they barely understood. These women were different, professional soldiers in their way, but he saw in their faces the same exhaustion, the same relief at survival mixed with fear of what came next. "Your work assignments begin tomorrow," he told them through an interpreter. "You will work farms in the county. The labor is hard, but the treatment is fair. You are protected under the Geneva Convention. Any mistreatment of you will be prosecuted. Any attempt to escape will be met with appropriate measures." The women stood silent in the mess hall. Through the windows they could see fields stretching to infinity, green and impossibly flat, nothing like the rocky terrain of Tunisia or the mountains of their homeland. This was a landscape that swallowed distance, that made horizon lines disappear into heat shimmer. That night in the barracks, they whispered in German while guards walked the perimeter outside. "What kind of place is this?" someone asked. Margaret Scholl, a nurse who had worked the Kasserine Pass field hospitals, stared at the ceiling. "Somewhere we survive," she said. "That is all that matters now." James Whittaker was 41 years old, and farming land his grandfather had cleared from Delta timber. 300 acres of cotton, some corn, vegetables for the household and the workers. His 2 sons were overseas, one in the Pacific, one in France. His wife had died of pneumonia in 1941. He worked the farm with hired help and sharecroppers, but the labor shortage had hit Mississippi like everywhere else. Young men were gone. The work remained. When the Army liaison officer arrived to discuss prisoner labor, James sat on his porch and listened to the proposition. German POWs, the officer explained. Women, nurses, most of them. They need work assignments. You need workers. The Army pays their wages. You provide supervision and transportation. James looked out at fields waiting for harvest. Cotton bolls were opening. The work was brutal in August heat. He thought about propaganda he had heard, about Germans, about what they had done in Europe. He thought about his sons fighting them. "How many?" he asked. 6, the officer said. "They will work 5 days a week. You provide water, a midday meal. No fraternization, no gifts. You report any problems immediately." James nodded slowly. The cotton would not wait for his moral calculations. "Send them Monday," he said. They arrived in an army truck at dawn on a Monday, when the air was still almost cool and dew made the cotton leaves shine. 6 women in gray prison uniforms stepped down onto red Delta clay, their faces carefully blank, their posture military. James watched from the porch, his foreman Ben Carter standing beside him. "They look scared," Ben said quietly. "They should be," James replied. But his voice carried no conviction. The guard, a young corporal named Davies, approached with paperwork. "These are your workers, Mr. Whitaker. They speak some English. The tall one, Margaret, speaks it well. They know what is expected. I will return at 5 o'clock." James nodded. He walked down the porch steps, boots loud on wood, and stopped 10 feet from the women. They stood in a line, hands at their sides, eyes forward. He could see tension in their shoulders the way they held their breath. "You will work the cotton fields," he said slowly. "The work is hard. You will have water whenever you need it. We break for a meal at noon. You do not leave the work area. You do not enter the house. You follow Ben's instructions." "Questions?" Margaret stepped forward slightly. Her English carried a heavy accent but was clear. "We understand," she said. "We will work." James studied her face. She was perhaps 30, with blonde hair pulled back severely, eyes that had seen things he could only imagine. There was no defiance in her expression, but no servility either. Just a kind of exhausted dignity. "Right then," he said. "Ben will show you what to do." They walked to the fields. 6 women and 1 foreman, their figures growing small against the vast green rows. James watched from the porch, a feeling he could not name settling in his chest like a stone. The first days were silent labor. The women worked with mechanical efficiency, moving down cotton rows with canvas bags, hands moving fast despite the heat. They did not complain. They did not slow. When James brought water jugs at mid-morning, they drank deeply but did not meet his eyes. Ben reported they were good workers, better than expected. "They know plants," he told James. "The nurses especially. They handle the cotton like they know what they are doing." By Wednesday, James noticed Margaret watching the farmhouse. Not with calculation or plotting, but with something like longing. That evening, he asked Davies about it. The guard shrugged. "They have been in camps for months," he said. "First in Africa, then the Atlantic crossing, then here. They have not seen normal life in a long time. Your farm probably looks like civilization to them." Thursday morning was the day James's understanding shifted. He was on the porch when he saw one of the younger women, a girl named Anna, who could not have been more than 20, collapse in the cotton field. The others rushed to her side. Margaret knelt, checking her pulse, speaking rapidly in German. James and Ben ran from the porch. "Heat exhaustion," Margaret said when they arrived. "She needs water, shade, cool cloth. Get her to the barn," James said. "Out of the sun." They carried Anna between them, James and Ben supporting her weight while Margaret walked alongside giving instructions like the nurse she was. In the barn's relative cool, they laid her on hay bales. Margaret loosened the girl's collar, placed a wet cloth on her forehead, elevated her feet. "She will be fine," Margaret said, "but she should not work more today." James nodded. "None of you should work more today," he said. "Take the afternoon in the shade." Margaret looked at him directly for the first time, surprise clear in her expression. "That is not necessary," she said. "It is August in Mississippi," James replied. "The cotton will still be there tomorrow." That evening, sitting on his porch after the truck had taken them back to camp, James thought about Margaret's competence, about how she had moved with the assured skill of someone who had saved lives before. The propaganda had not prepared him for this, for people. Friday arrived with heat that made the air feel solid. By noon, the temperature pushed past 95 degrees, humidity turning the delta into a steam bath. James had been planning something since the previous evening, something he knew violated the rules but felt necessary in a way he could not fully articulate. He made sweet tea. In Mississippi in 1944, sweet tea was not a beverage. It was a statement of civilization, of hospitality, of belonging to a place and a way of life. James's wife had made it in a particular way. Strong black tea, sugar added while still hot so it dissolved completely, then ice and lemon. The pitcher sweated on the kitchen counter while he worked, condensation running down the glass like rain. At noon, he brought it to the barn where the women took their break from the fields. 6 women sitting on hay bales, sharing water from a common jug, their uniforms soaked through with sweat. They fell silent when he entered carrying the pitcher and glasses on a tray. "Drink this," he said, setting it down. "It is hot work. This will help." The women stared at the pitcher. Margaret translated for those whose English was weak. James saw confusion cross their faces, then something else. Fear. "Was is das?" one woman asked. "What is it?" "Sweet tea," James said. "It is what we drink here." Nobody moved. Margaret stood slowly, approaching the pitcher like it might bite. She looked at James, and he saw calculation in her eyes, saw her trying to understand the trap. "You first," she said quietly. James understood then. They thought it was poison. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Of course they thought that. They were prisoners. They were the enemy. Every piece of propaganda they had been fed in Germany had probably told them Americans were cruel, that they tortured prisoners, that death was preferable to capture. And here was a southern farmer offering them a strange beverage in the middle of a private barn. James picked up a glass. He poured tea, the amber liquid catching light through the barn slats, ice cubes clinking against glass. He drank deeply, half the glass, then set it down and wiped his mouth. "It is just tea," he said, "with sugar. That is all." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment. Then she poured a glass and drank. Her eyes widened. She drank again, then looked at the other women and spoke rapidly in German. They crowded around the pitcher. "Süß," one woman said. "So sweet. Like liquid cake," another added in broken English. They drank the entire pitcher. James stood watching, feeling something shift in the barn's hot air, in the space between enemy and human being. When they finished, Margaret turned to him. "Thank you," she said. "We have not tasted something like this in 2 years." "It is just tea," James repeated, but his voice was not quite steady. "In Germany," Margaret said quietly, "we were told you would starve us, beat us, treat us as less than animals. We were told it was better to die fighting than to be captured by Americans." James looked at this woman who had treated his enemy soldiers' wounds, who had survived Rommel's collapse, who had crossed an ocean in a prison ship to end up picking cotton in Mississippi. "A country where we poison people with sweet tea," he said. For the first time since they had arrived, Margaret smiled. That evening at Camp Clinton, Margaret wrote a letter to her sister in Hamburg. The mail would go through military censors, arrive months late if it arrived at all, but she wrote anyway. "Dear Helga," she began, "we are somewhere in America's South, in a place called Mississippi. The land is flat and hot beyond anything I experienced in Tunisia. We work on farms. Today I thought a farmer was trying to poison us with tea. I was wrong. He was trying to give us something sweet. I do not know what to make of this country." In his farmhouse, James sat at a kitchen table and wrote to his son in France. "I have German prisoners working the cotton now," he wrote. "Women, nurses from Africa. They are not what I expected. Today I gave them sweet tea and they thought it was poison. What have we done to each other that a glass of tea seems impossible?" These letters would cross in the mail, carried by military postal systems across oceans and continents, arriving to recipients who would read them and understand that the war was not what anyone had imagined, that it was more complicated and more human and more strange than any propaganda had prepared them for. August became September. The women came every weekday, worked the fields, drank sweet tea at noon, returned to camp at evening. James learned their names, their stories in fragments. Anna was from Bremen, had been a telegraph operator. Greta had worked in a field hospital near Tobruk. Elsa was older, 43, had been a head nurse at a Wehrmacht medical facility. They learned American words y'all gonna fix to. The rhythms of Delta speech that turned English into something musical and strange. James learned some German, Guten Morgen, danke, Entschuldigung, the language of basic courtesy. Ben, who had been skeptical at first, became their advocate. "They work harder than most men I know," he told James. "And they do not complain." The other farm workers, sharecroppers, and hired hands watched the arrangement with varying degrees of acceptance. Some muttered about Germans on American soil. Others saw only workers who eased their burden. A few, like old Samuel, who had lost a grandson at Normandy, refused to speak to them at all, but did not interfere. James's neighbor, Robert Sims, stopped by one afternoon. "Heard you got German girls working your cotton," he said. "I got workers," James replied. "That is all." "People are talking," Robert said, "saying you are too friendly with them, that you feed them meals, give them tea." "The Geneva Convention requires humane treatment," James said. "I am following the law. The law and what is right are not always the same thing," Robert said. Then he looked at James for a long moment. "But maybe this time they are." In late September, Margaret approached James with a request. She spoke carefully, aware she was pushing against boundaries. "The area behind the barn," she said. "It is unused. We could plant vegetables there. For your household. It would give us something to do when field work is slow." James considered. It violated no rules he knew of, might even increase productivity. But it meant the women staying longer hours, spending more time on his property, becoming more integrated into the farm's rhythm. "What vegetables?" he asked. "What grows here in fall?" Margaret said. "We know plants. Cabbage, turnips, carrots, lettuce if the season allows." James nodded slowly. "You can plant it," he said. "But it is for the camp kitchen, not just my household. All the prisoners eat what you grow." Margaret's face showed surprise, then something like gratitude. "That is fair," she said. The garden became a project that transformed the dynamic. The women brought seeds somehow obtained at camp. James never asked how. They worked the soil behind the barn with the same efficiency they brought to cotton fields, but with something else too. Something like care, like investment. They sang while they worked. German songs, folk melodies James did not recognize but found himself humming later. They laughed sometimes, forgetting briefly where they were and why. Ben built them a scarecrow from old clothes and burlap. The women dressed it in a spare prison uniform and gave it a hat. They named it Herman, after Goering, and told jokes at its expense that James could not fully understand, but recognized as something important. The ability to mock their own former leaders, to distance themselves from what they had been. October brought cooler weather and the garden's first yields. Margaret and Elsa appeared one morning with a basket of vegetables, carrots, radishes, early lettuce. They approached James with the formality of a military delegation. "For your table," Margaret said, "the first harvest. Without your permission to plant, there would be nothing." James looked at the basket, at vegetables grown by enemy hands in Mississippi soil. Every regulation he knew said he should refuse. Accepting gifts from prisoners was forbidden. It implied a relationship beyond captor and captive. He took the basket. "Thank you," he said, "but next time, this goes to the camp kitchen first. My table comes after the prisoners are fed." Margaret held his gaze. "In Germany," she said slowly, "I was taught that Americans were greedy, that they took everything for themselves and left others to starve." "In America," James replied, "we were taught Germans were monsters who could not be reasoned with." They stood in silence for a moment, the basket between them like a bridge. "I think," Margaret said quietly, "we were both taught lies." On a Thursday in October, the women were unusually quiet. James noticed them whispering in German, noticed Anna looking sad. At the noon break, he asked Margaret what was wrong. "It is Anna's birthday," she said. 21 years old. She is homesick. We all are, but birthdays are hard. James nodded. He thought about his sons overseas, about birthdays they would spend far from home. That evening, after the truck had taken the women back to camp, he spoke with Ben. "Tomorrow is Friday," he said. "Can you spare time to make something?" Ben listened to the plan. "It is against regulations," he said. "I know," James replied. "Davies will have to look the other way. I will handle Davies." Friday at noon, they brought a small cake to the barn. Nothing elaborate, yellow cake with sugar icing made from rationed ingredients stretched to their limit. But it was cake, and it was unexpected. And when they presented it to Anna with shy formality, the girl burst into tears. The women sang Zum Geburtstag viel Glück, the German birthday song. James and Ben stood awkwardly to the side, feeling like intruders on something private. When the song ended, Anna approached James with tears still on her face. "Danke," she said. "Thank you. I did not think anyone here knew. I did not think anyone would care." "Everyone's birthday matters," James said simply. That night, Margaret wrote in her diary, a small notebook she kept hidden in her barracks. "Today, an American farmer gave one of us a birthday cake," she wrote. "I do not understand this country. We are their prisoners. We are their enemies. Yet they give us cake. They plant gardens with us. They remember our birthdays. The propaganda prepared us for cruelty. How do we make sense of kindness?" November brought news of Allied advances in Europe. American forces pushing through France. British and Canadian troops in Belgium. Soviet armies closing on Germany's eastern border. In the camp mess hall, the prisoners listened to radio broadcasts with growing dread. They were winning the war, but for these women, victory meant the destruction of their homeland. The mood affected their work. They were quieter, more withdrawn. Margaret moved through the cotton fields like someone sleepwalking. When James asked what was wrong, she shook her head. "My sister is in Hamburg," she said finally. "The bombing there is constant. I do not know if she is alive. I am safe here in Mississippi and my family may be dying." James had no words for this. What could he say? That the bombs were necessary? That Germany had started this? That her sister was enemy? All true, and all inadequate in the face of her fear. "I am sorry," he said. "It is all I can offer. But I am sorry." Margaret looked at him with exhausted eyes. "You have sons in Europe, yes?" "Two," James confirmed. "Then you understand," she said. "The not knowing, the waiting for letters that may not come." "I understand," James said. They stood together in the cotton field, a Mississippi farmer and a German nurse, both waiting for news of people they loved in places being destroyed, both helpless to do anything but wait and work and hope. Winter came to Mississippi, bringing cold mornings and early darkness. The cotton was harvested. The field work shifted to maintenance, repairs, preparations for spring planting. The women still came, but the work was lighter, more varied. Margaret asked James if they could decorate the barn for Christmas. "Just small things," she said, "some pine branches, nothing elaborate." James agreed. He brought pine boughs from trees on his property. The women arranged them with cloth scraps into something like wreaths. It was modest, almost pathetic, but it transformed the barn into something that acknowledged the season. On December 23rd, James brought something wrapped in cloth. The women gathered around as he unwrapped it, 6 small wooden crosses, each carved with a name. "Ben made these," James said, "for the garden, so you can mark your work." The women stared at the crosses, their names in English letters carved carefully: Margaret, Anna, Greta, Elsa, Lisa, Katha. "They are beautiful," Margaret said quietly. "But why?" "Because what you planted matters," James said. "Because your work here matters. When you are gone, people will see these and know Germans grew food here during the war. Know that you were here." Elsa, who rarely spoke, said something in German. Margaret translated. She says in Germany, "We were told we were Untermenschen to you. Subhuman. These crosses say otherwise." "You are not subhuman," James said. "You never were." Christmas Day, James drove to Camp Clinton with a truck full of vegetables from the garden and a large pot of chicken soup his housekeeper had made. The camp commandant raised eyebrows but accepted the donation. That evening, the German prisoners ate soup made by American hands, flavored with vegetables grown by their own labor in Mississippi soil. April 1945 brought news that changed everything. Allied forces crossing the Rhine, Soviet troops in Berlin, Hitler's suicide, Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was over. At Camp Clinton, the prisoners received the news in stunned silence. They were no longer soldiers of an active combatant nation. They were simply displaced persons waiting for decisions about their future. Would they be sent home immediately? Held longer? Allowed to stay? On the farm, Margaret and the others worked with a kind of desperate focus, as if physical labor could prevent them from thinking about what came next. James watched them, and felt something he had not expected: dread at their departure. They would leave soon. They would return to Germany, to whatever remained of their homes and families. The arrangement that had brought them to his farm every day for 9 months would end. The barn would be empty. The garden would grow wild. The small community that had formed in this unlikely place would scatter. "What will you do?" he asked Margaret one afternoon. "When you go home?" "If there is a home to return to," she said. "If my sister is alive, if Bremen still exists, I will try to rebuild, try to forget." "You should not forget this," James said, gesturing at the farm, the garden, the work they had done together. Margaret smiled sadly. "I will never forget Mississippi," she said. "Never forget that the enemy fed me cake and gave me sweet tea and taught me that propaganda is stronger than truth until you meet real people." In June, the orders came. The women prisoners at Camp Clinton would be repatriated in stages starting in July. Margaret and her group would be among the first to leave. The last week they came to the farm. Everyone worked quietly. The garden was thriving, vegetables growing in neat rows marked with wooden crosses bearing German names. The barn still had pine boughs from Christmas, slowly drying in rafters. Everything was the same, and everything was ending. On their final Friday, James closed the farm early. He brought out sweet tea and food, more than was necessary, more than regulations allowed. They sat in the barn's shade and ate together, prisoner and farmer and foreman. The boundaries that had once seemed so absolute, now blurred beyond recognition. "I have something for each of you," James said. He distributed small packages wrapped in brown paper. Inside each was a photograph. James had asked Davies to take pictures the previous week. 6 women standing in the garden they had planted. The barn behind them, Mississippi sky overhead. So you remember, James said. So you can show your families that you survived, that you worked here, that you were treated like human beings. Margaret held her photograph with trembling hands. In Germany, she said, we were told America was our enemy forever, that there could never be peace between us. I was told the same about Germany, James replied. Yet here we are, Margaret said. Here we are, James agreed. Anna, the youngest, spoke up in halting English. When I return to Bremen, I will tell my children someday. Tell them about the Mississippi farmer who gave us sweet tea when we thought he would poison us, who remembered my birthday, who planted a garden with the enemy. Tell them it does not have to be like this, James said. Tell them people are just people, once you get past the uniforms and the propaganda. The truck arrived at dusk. Corporal Davies helped them load up, his expression carefully neutral but his movements gentle. The women climbed in one by one. Margaret was last. She paused at the truck's tailgate and looked back at James. Thank you, she said, for everything. James nodded, not trusting his voice. The truck pulled away down the dirt road, red dust rising in its wake. 6 women in gray uniforms disappearing toward an uncertain future. Ben stood beside James, watching until the truck vanished. You did a good thing, he said quietly. I gave them sweet tea and let them plant vegetables, James replied. That is all. You gave them their humanity back, Ben said, in a war that tried to take it. That is more than sweet tea. July 1945. Margaret and the others were processed through debriefing camps, given papers, put on ships headed east across the Atlantic. They landed in France, were transported to Germany by train, saw their homeland for the first time in 3 years. The Germany they returned to was not the Germany they had left. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, families were scattered or dead. Margaret found her sister alive in Hamburg, living in a basement with 3 other families. Bremen, where Anna had grown up, was 70% destroyed. But they carried with them something unexpected, a memory of an enemy who had been kind, of a place called Mississippi, where the propaganda had proven false, of sweet tea and gardens and birthday cakes given by a farmer who had sons fighting their army, but still saw them as human. In August, a letter arrived at the Whitaker farm. It had been opened by military censors, stamped with official seals, forwarded through channels. James sat on his porch and read it. Dear Mr. Whitaker, it began. I am writing from Hamburg. I wanted you to know that I survived the journey home, that I found my sister alive. Germany is destroyed, but we will rebuild. I wanted to thank you again for your kindness during our time at your farm. I learned more about America from you than from any propaganda. I learned that enemies can become friends if we are willing to see each other as human beings first. The photograph you gave me is precious to me. I keep it with my other treasures. Someday, when the world is sane again, I hope to return to Mississippi and see the garden one more time. Until then, I remember the sweet tea and the kindness, and I tell everyone I meet that not all enemies are demons. Some are just people caught in circumstances beyond their control. Thank you for teaching me this. Margaret Scholl. James read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with his wife's wedding ring, his son's birth certificates, the other things he considered worth keeping. Years later, historians would note that approximately 425,000 German prisoners worked in the United States during World War II. Most were men from Africa Corps units or U-boat crews. A small percentage were women, nurses and support personnel captured in North Africa. They worked farms, forests, canneries across the country, their labor filling gaps left by Americans serving overseas. Most of these encounters were unremarkable. Prisoners worked, guards supervised. Everyone followed regulations. But in places, something else happened. Small acts of kindness that defied propaganda. Moments of human connection that transcended enmity. A birthday cake in Mississippi. Sweet tea offered in good faith. A garden planted by enemy hands that produced food for everyone. James Whitaker continued farming until 1962, when age and arthritis forced him to sell the land. The garden behind the barn was still producing vegetables, tended by the family who bought the property. The wooden crosses with German names had weathered and faded, but remained standing. Margaret Scholl became a nurse again in Hamburg, working in hospitals that treated patients regardless of nationality. She never forgot Mississippi, never forgot the lesson that enemies are made, not born. In 1968, she wrote a memoir about her war experiences. A chapter was titled Sweet Tea in the Enemy's Country, Anna returned to Bremen, married, had children. She told them about her 21st birthday, about the cake that arrived when she thought she was forgotten. Her grandchildren would grow up knowing that their grandmother had once been America's prisoner, and America had remembered her birthday. The incident that had seemed so charged, the sweet tea offered and refused, the moment when poison was suspected and kindness discovered, became part of the larger story of World War II's complexity. The story of how propaganda dissolved when confronted with actual human beings, how ideologies crumbled in the face of simple decency, how a Mississippi farmer and German nurses found common ground in a garden and a glass of sweet tea. The camp at Clinton closed in 1946. The buildings were dismantled, the wire removed, the towers torn down. The land returned to civilian use, but for a brief period, it had been a place where enemies became human to each other, where the war's cruelty was tempered by small mercies, where understanding grew in the most unlikely soil. December 1973. James Whitaker, now 70 years old, sat on his porch and talked with a local historian recording oral histories of the war years. "What do you remember most about the German prisoners?" the historian asked. "The sweet tea," James said. "The day I gave them sweet tea, and they thought it was poison." "Why that moment?" "Because that is when I understood what we had done to each other," James replied. "Not the armies, not the governments, us, regular people. We had been taught to see each other as monsters, and it took a glass of tea to prove we were all just human beings trying to survive." "Did it change how you saw the war?" James was quiet for a long time. "It showed me the war was necessary, but the hate was not," he said finally. "That we could fight without dehumanizing. That victory did not require turning our enemies into demons. I wish more people had learned that lesson." The interview concluded. The historian packed up his equipment and drove away. James sat alone on the porch, watching the sun set over land that had once grown cotton picked by German hands, vegetables planted by enemy nurses, a garden that had taught more about peace than any treaty. Somewhere in Hamburg, an elderly woman named Margaret kept a photograph on her mantel. 6 women in prison uniforms standing in a Mississippi garden, smiling despite everything. Behind them, a barn. Above them, a sky. Between them and the camera, a distance measured not in miles but in choices. The choice to be kind, the choice to see humanity, the choice to offer sweet tea when suspicion would have been easier. The war had ended decades ago. The garden had long since returned to wild grass. But the lesson remained, planted deep in red delta clay growing still, that enemies are made, not born, and unmade the same way. One glass of sweet tea at a time, one birthday cake, one wooden cross with a German name marking a place where someone planted vegetables and learned that the enemy's country could also be kind. The cicadas screamed in the delta heat. The horizon shimmered, and the story endured like the best stories do, because it told a truth people needed to hear, that even in the worst of times, decency survives if we choose to let it.